Welcome to the Knife Show, where we dissect the human psyche and society. My name is Denzel. I'm an ENFJ.
And my name is Joyce, and I'm an INFJ. And we're here today to talk about how to get into action as an NFJ. And this might be difficult for you, especially if you are the INFJ variant, because you have SE as your fourth function. And so it may take a little longer for you to jump into action, and you might have to almost like simulate things in your mind before you really jump into action a little longer than an ENFJ does. But perhaps both these types, they kind of have to think through the concepts and the ideas before they get into the reality and the sensory about it. And so how do you decide when enough information is enough and when you're ready to jump in? Today's topic is about that.
Yeah, so pretty much like what Joyce said, getting into action is mainly attributed to the function SE, extroverted sensing, which is the tertiary function of an ENFJ and the inferior function of an INFJ. This is not the only function that's responsible for getting into action. So, like, obviously, if you do not have SE in your stack, that doesn't mean that you never get into action, but it's the function that's most attributed to that. And this isn't the only facet of that function. SE is also attributed to understanding, or like having like paying attention to aesthetics and, an athletic, type of mindset, or like being ready to like respond to the environment and seeing things clearly for what they are. And I think that's actually probably a reason why a lot of times NFJs or NJs in general might have more of a hesitancy to jump into action as opposed to like higher SE types, so all the SP types who see things and assess situations clearly for what they are, and then they jump in. And not only are they able to assess them clearly for what they are, but they're also able to respond to things pretty quickly. Whereas, like, the lower SE is in your stack, then the slower you are at responding to something, especially stimuli or an unexpected situation that hits you like unexpectedly. So, as an ENFJ, for example, um, ENFJs have more of a tendency to hop into action more quickly than, for example, like an INFJ might. And this is for pretty much two reasons that are kind of combined. First and foremost, the ENFJ is an extrovert by nature. So that means that they see the real world, or the real world to them is the external world. And introverts, by contrast, the real world to them is their internal world. Now, there's obviously some overlap when it comes to stuff like this, but essentially, for an introvert, when they are approaching the external world, if they get feedback from there, they have to always check it back in with their internal world. And for this reason, it takes a little bit more time for them to process certain things so they can calibrate and it can align. Whereas, like for extroverts, they operate in the external. And so, therefore, because they operate in the external world more frequently, then they're more adjusted or more acclimated to retaliating or to responding to quickly and unexpected, stimuli. So a type such as the INFJ, for example, would have to think a lot more further into the future and have to future pace and run more simulations and really prepare themselves and position themselves before they take on something in the external, because they want to make sure that whatever they receive in the external will do as little damage or uh, kind of like not shift like as much in their internal world, pretty much. Whereas like an extrovert, they're not really checking in so much with their internal world and trying to recalibrate it as much, because the external world is what's already they've been like working in. So as an ENFJs will still be running simulations. They still have NI, introverted intuition, which always comes with extroverted sensing. In case if you don't know, it's two sides of the same coin. So extroverted sensing looks at what's going on right now, what's the unified reality, and then based off of what's going on right now, then introverted intuition reads into it, and it's like, okay, what does this mean? What is the symbolism of what's going on right now. And then based off of what the symbolism of what's going on right now, how can we project into the future and see what's going to happen? And if I can now see what's going to happen, how do I prepare for what's going to happen? Or even set it into motion. And sometimes an INJ can spend so much time in that paralysis and running the simulation over and over and over again and making sure like they've loaded their intuition up to like 90 to 95, 99%, where it's like, okay, now I'm sure that almost nothing can go wrong. And they just want to leave as little room possible for them to have to improvise or for something unexpected to happen, which, as a human being, you can never truly have nothing ever be unexpected that happens, or you there's always something unexpected that is going to happen eventually, is essentially what I'm saying, no matter what type that you are. But the INJs try to minimize that as much as possible, whereas the ENJs, they have a better time with being able to handle what's thrown at them because they have a higher extroverted sensing. So they won't spend as much time trying to mull over and process and observe, because if anything, hopping into the action will help them be able to assess the situation more. But even then, they still want to run that simulation so they can understand, okay, how far can I go? And it's all based on, your skill set. So, we shouldn't expect an INFJ or an INTJ to be able to do what an ENFJ or ENTJ can do, and then vice versa. So all of that being said, based off of your type, we're going to talk today about when is it okay for you to actually hop into action. When have you been sitting and observing? I know that in our world today, we praise observing so much. Everybody likes to say, yeah, I'm so observant. I prefer to sit back and just watch things. And that person is usually seen as wiser and all of that. But honestly, sometimes after all of that observing, they might do the same thing that an ESP did about 10 days ago and was able to succeed in. And it's like, okay, so were you really that wise and smart and observant? Or did you just postpone a lot of things that took this other person 5 seconds to be able to figure out? Maybe they're both of equal intelligence, but it's just, again, different approaches. The ESP is going to have certain things come faster to them than an INJ is going to. And then, it's different now when it comes to the ISP and the ENJ. And then if you don't even have SC in your stack, so like you're an NP or an SJ or something like that, well, that's a whole different situation too. But yeah, today focusing on the NJ types, especially NFJs, we're going to be talking about like how long, like, are you supposed to actually be running a simulation, and when is it now unhealthy for you? Like, okay, you've been sitting in this paralysis for too long and you've been observing and post-processing and running the simulation for too long. Now it's time to do something, versus, okay, you actually hopped into that way too fast. You needed to slow down and take some more time to gauge things.
Absolutely. And so it can be difficult to hop into action sometimes when you're processing what's happening. So with introverted intuition, you're looking for what's behind the curtain. And so sometimes when you're processing and you're observing the situation, it can be hard to simultaneously just act. Because one of the pros to being an extroverted sensing dominant type is that you're really good at simplifying a situation so that you're like, yeah, it's this black and white thing. We can just go. We can go, because I'm very certain of what's happening here. So I'm just going to act on that information right away. Whereas if you have an eye higher up, you're like, there's more that meets the eye. And so you're going to take more time to see what are the different factors going into this, because you want the trajectory of the situation to go in the specific way that's positive and not negative. And so because you're aware of the implications, the future ripple effects into the far distantness, then you're going to be a little bit more hesitant to impose an action into the world, because actions come with certain consequences. And when you're too aware of the consequences, it can create a paralysis. And plus, if processing is your preferred state, you might be inactive more than you think, because a lot of a lot of time can pass in the external world, whereas it's like a little bit of time in your mind because you're still going through it all and still processing it all. And so you don't realize how much time has passed you by. And then you blink and you realize you're, let's say, like 30 years old, and you're like, I wish I acted more in my life. And so oftentimes, in overthinking can be a greater vice than impatience for specifically an INFJ or an introvert in general, because introverts can look so much before leaping that they end up not leaping, and that can cause them to just completely stall with action.
So an ENFJ on Twitter had actually tweeted about a month ago saying sometimes thinking too much can lead to even more foolish decisions than impulsiveness. And I think that a lot of times, like I said, we don't really I personally think that we reward the people who are no like it's really like almost like a badge of honor to say like, yeah, I'm so observant, and I just sit back and I just watch. I watch for like 10 years before I do anything, and it's like there's both good and bad to that. It's bad to be very impulsive, yes, but it's also bad to be very paralytic. I don't know, like to be in a state of paralysis for so long. Like we have to find that sweet spot, which is what NISE usually is, like finding that perfect moment to hop into action. Reading the current winds and all of the temperature and everything that's playing along, so that you can know like, okay, this is the poignant moment that we need to be able uh, to execute this plan. So if you are an INFJ, then you have to be able to know that you are watching the current so that you can finally make a move. And you always have to be looking for those openings. And there's not just one opening. The NE users will tell you that. There's not, I know that as SE and I users, we often feel like, no, there's one specific opening. And if I miss that, I'm doomed. I get into those moments a lot of times. It's like, no, it's never going to be that time like that. But a lot of times, Lemony Snicket, the author of the series of Unfortunate Events, once said that if we wait until we are ready, then we are going to be waiting forever. So a lot of times it's just best to just hop into the action, even as an SE inferior, because sometimes you're not even going to be able to get the knowledge that you need until you're actually in the situation. It's still good to run that simulation as much as you can and try to mitigate like how much you'll need to improvise in that moment, but you have to understand that a lot of times making that first mistake, even though you don't want to, but like hopping into action and getting into the situation, you might learn things. You not even might, you will learn things that you would not have even been able to conjure up in your mind just by sitting alone and observing. A lot of things you have to immerse yourself into it before you're able to actually understand what you're supposed to do. And it's healthy to mitigate how much you have to improvise. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to really, really just decrease all chances of improvising, then you're going to really put yourself in a tight spot. So as an ENJ, especially, being more comfortable of hopping into action, make sure that I mean, your talent is running that simulation. So I think that ENJs, it's very rare that they are paralyzed in that sense. So it's almost like one could say that, I'm hesitant to say it, but I feel like it's probably safe to say that if you are an ENJ, then you probably are not waiting too long. I think that ENJs, especially having NISE in the middle, they often will wait, even when if they really start to feel like they're waiting too long, then they usually will hop into action. I don't think that they get so much in that paralysis. If anything, they might act a little bit too soon a lot of times. So don't be afraid to wait a little bit longer and to observe, even if it's something as small as like, oh, I got this text message. A lot of times I remember me as an ENFJ. I used to get text messages from certain people, and I would think, oh, shoot, I need to respond to that right away and whatnot. And I started practicing something about a year or two ago, where if I got certain text messages from people, I would see it and I'd read it and I'd have an immediate response in my head, but then I'd wait a little bit and then I'd let it percolate for a little bit, whatever. And then later on, I have a much better response for that message. And if it's not time sensitive, then that's great. And it's like, wow, I'm so glad I didn't go with my first response. You want to know how to respond, not to react. And so always try to run that if you're an ENJ. Now, I think for an INJ, probably want to go the opposite direction where it's like not necessarily like learn to react, but I feel like very rarely will you react because you're so thoughtful of a person. And so you can probably trust yourself a little bit more to just jump into the action. And perhaps you will actually be able to be like, oh, I'm a lot better at this FETE thing than I thought that I was. Just like with ENJs, it's like you spend more time in that meditation. I was like, oh, you know what? I actually can come up with a lot better stuff than what I probably was doing beforehand. And like I said, those are just some small examples of like, if somebody was like to text you or something. But now, if you have like a certain plan, like you're trying to launch a business, or you're trying to get started with that book, you're trying to go talk to that girl, you're trying to start this conversation with someone, or like address this conflict, or start school, whatever it might be. Sure, think about what's coming up ahead, but if you are an ENJ, know that you are probably moving a little bit too fast, and it's okay to slow down and trust that you're not going to miss that opportunity if you slow down. If anything, you're going to probably get the best out of that opportunity if you slow down. And then for the INJs, I say speed up. Like you are not going to go too fast. I doubt that, because once again, you are already so thoughtful of a person that you've probably already ran enough of a simulation. And so now when you hop into it, trust your SE a little bit more than you usually do. And I think that you'll soon realize, like, oh, wow, I'm a little bit sure it's my inferior function, but I'm a little bit better at this than I thought that I was. And I didn't realize how much I had already run these simulations until I got into the situation. And now, even because of that, I'm glad I hopped in, because now I'm seeing things that I would have not been able to future pace just by sitting on the outside. But after I immersed myself into it, it's like, oh, actually, I want to do this. I'm glad that I still have time to be able to switch my mind on this right now.
Absolutely, Denzel. There's also the element of fear that comes from overthinking. So if you are paralyzed by inaction, it can be sourced from a fear of putting yourself out there. So it's perhaps an incentive to look at, is there something about the situation that you're afraid of? Do you feel like it's too good for you? Or do you feel like you're going to mess up? Or do you fear that you don't know what to do in a situation? So sometimes we can justify our fears through over rationalizing, and it can seem like our logic is flawless when really it's post hoc reasoning off of our scaredness, which can really dampen action for sure. There sometimes needs to be a sense of urgency too to act. So sometimes if you are feeling like you don't want to do anything, it could be that you don't have a reason for urgency yet. And a way of building that is to either build a mindset in which you notice you really actually have to do this right now. Like there's an opportunity that will close, there's a window of time. It's almost like a sale at a store. Within a period of time, that sale is going to disappear. And so if you buy it during the sale time, you're going to get way more bang for your buck than you will get for the non-sale time. And so perhaps thoughts like that could help build a sense of urgency. But however, it's difficult sometimes for, INFJs to internalize a sense of urgency, because if your inner world feels more real, even if there's outer world urgency, it can feel like the outer world's not even that real anyway, so why? Now that's where you get into a tricky situation, because ENFJs at least have the external world motivation of FE connecting to get them to go out and to act like right away. So there's an incentive, whereas like INFJs do have FE connecting up there and they do want it, but sometimes it can almost be hard to recognize it as a real thing if you're too much in your thoughts, because you start to just kind of forget about reality a little bit. And so that disconnection from reality can cause an inaction. And it's good to kind of address that. And so, yeah, being more in the present moment might also help that.
Yeah, I was looking for, I just finished the book Strength to Love by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the quotes that he said in the book, I wish I had it verbatim. The main point of what he was saying about fear was that it's irrational a lot of times, most of the times, like there is a rational fear and then there's an irrational fear. Sometimes when we are fearful to hop into action, it really is best to think of, okay, what is the worst that can happen? And how likely is that to happen? And if it does even happen, is it really as bad as we think that it's going to be? Like, for example, sometimes when I hop up on stage and I start to speak or I start to give like a spoken word or something like that, some of the worst things that can happen that I could possibly think of is, oh, I'll forget my line. Now, if that happens, then what's going to happen? Is everyone going to be like, boo, and actually start throwing tomatoes at me? Um, Probably not. If anything, if I'm really understanding people, if anything, a lot of times my pattern recognition has shown me that a lot of times they'll be like, hey, it's all right. They'll even start clapping for you because they know, like, hey, people forget their lines. It's okay. Like just start over. It's all right. It's okay for me to be like, hey guys, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I back up a little bit? And then if I still mess up, it's like, hey, I'm just be honest with you guys. I'm sorry. I kind of can't remember these next couple of lines. I'm gonna skip over that part and just go over this, or I'm just gonna stop here and next time I will come back and do better. I apologize. Nobody's gonna be like, wow, that guy really sucked or whatever like that. Like, it's good. Now, does that mean I don't prepare? No, I still should prepare. But after preparing, the only best that you can do is just be ready for if that worst case scenario were happening and how bad is it going to be. Now, if I start thinking of stuff like, well, what if my pants falls down? Okay, that probably would be embarrassing too. But that could even go one of two ways. First of all, let me just make sure that I have a very tight belt then. Like that's probably an irrational fear. Like unless if I really have like loose pants. But even then, you could even take it as far as like, okay, am I comfortable with the idea that even though the possibility of this happening is very, very low, if my pants fell down, am I ready to accept the whoops and just pull it right back up and make a little bit of a joke of it, like, okay, maybe not everybody's pants falls down when they get up on stage, but everyone has a body, like I don't know, like when you take it to certain extremes like that and then you accustom yourself to that worst case scenario, a lot of times it helps you because then, especially as a high stack NI user, a lot of times my reality is what I'm walking into, but I've already trajected into the future. So if I've already lived that reality in my head, then it's like now I'm already ready for it. And so a lot of times it is safe to think about that worst case and then find a way to acclimate yourself. So that's like, if I mess up, no biggie. This is what I would probably do in that situation to fix it. And once you're able to do that, that's where SE comes in. It's like, oh, this is how I would just act or I'd shift in that situation. And a lot of times, that worst case scenario isn't even going to happen to begin with. So, like I said, don't be afraid to hop into action, especially if you're an INJ, and exercise that FETE, And then if you are an ENJ, don't be afraid to slow down. You're already good at being able to hop into action a lot of times. And yeah, you're most likely going to know. You do not have to also wait like forever, just like the ESP. If the ESP a lot of times waited as long as the INJ does, it'd be a waste of time because they already often know what to do. And even if they didn't, their SE comes with like a double edged sword. It might be impulsive, but it's also the same thing that gets them out of situations. So they'll be able to hop in and then they'll know what to do once they're in there a lot of times. And so you should, as an ESP, you don't have to wait as long as an INJ might. And that doesn't mean that you're more stupid in a lot of situations. If anything, it just means that that's one of your skills. Like you just know how to act in certain situations. And that doesn't mean that INJ is stupid either, but they just have a different set of skills, and so know where your skill set is be more daunting with either taking the time to slow down if you're an ENJ especially, and taking the time to speed up and hop into action and allow yourself to, flex a little bit more of that SE if you're an INJ.
I completely agree, Denzel, with the fear is irrational most of the time. And typically, I'm cliche and I relate everything back to a trauma response. So I think a lot of fear is an indirect trauma response. There might be a fear of pain that you have that you're unconscious of, that you're avoiding. And I actually think overthinking is one of the biggest pandemics of the world, because I know a lot of people with so much skill and they just don't put themselves out there because they're overthinking it. They're saying, oh, I am just going to leave my talents to myself. No one is ever going to see it. And there's someone with like a quarter of the talent already putting themselves out there and doing the thing that that person wanted to do. And so having that, SC event happen over and over again, it's like, okay, I really have to put myself out there. So I created an NI philosophy around you are going. I always talk about death, and it's because I find it a very big motivating factor in life. I find both love and death to be like some of the biggest thought ideas that I build off of. And it's because I see all of these talented people, they just don't put themselves out there because they don't either see their talent or they just overthink it. And so they're like, I need all of the ducks to be in order before I actually put myself out there. And I'm like, literally, you could have just put out the poem that you just wrote right now out there and it would have been amazing and people would have loved it. People think that there's way more in put themselves into action than there actually is. Like they don't have to do all the steps that they make in their mind. They can just take that first move. SE Dom types always talk about everything starts with the first note. And so literally you just have to use the first note to go out there. Whereas overcomplicating the plan causes inaction because it is more simple than we give it credit for, which is something I've had to learn, right? This is not something that came naturally, but the morbidity of death and the the ultimate consequence of your actions, it shocks you into realizing these things that don't come naturally.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really the biggest thing. Like SE is always going to lean on oversimplifying, and NI is going to always lean on overcomplicating. Find the sweet spot. Find the sweet spot of, okay, it's not that simple, but it's also not that complicated. Where is the simplicity and where is the complication? What am I most capable of dealing with? Like, look at your own skill set and trust yourself. Be a little bit more daunting in that sense. And just like what Joyce said, take that first step to be able to help. And then sometimes this even goes high, like for more higher SE users as well. Like ISPs, they are notorious a lot of times for being in that TINI or that FINI, and like, okay, I'm just waiting for this magical sign to hit me to get into action, or like, oh, I'm waiting to like know all of the steps. And it's like, as an ISFP, you're not going to know all of the steps. Unfortunately, your TE inferior is just not going to always know that. Your skill is going to be hopping into action and kind of like improvising, and then your intuition is going to guide you along the way once you're in the situation. Cross that bridge when you get there is actually a real thing for the ISPs. But until you get to that bridge, you're just not going to know how to do it. And so a lot of times you have to like actually start walking, and then all of a sudden you start seeing your intuition start bringing things up to you that you would have not been able to future pace if you were sitting by yourself. Kind of like with the INJ, although they can actually future pace a lot, but to the same extent, the INJ, there's still certain things that they have to learn to cross that bridge when they get there, and take that first step. Um, so yeah, I feel complete with what I had to say on that so far. Do you have anything lastly to add, Joyce?
Yeah, with introverted intuition, it is responsible for processing what is gathered. And so when you lead with it as a dominant function, you can just be in an eternal state of processing, because the processing in itself is very fulfilling. It puts you in a flow state. And so you can forget to act because, you're kind of, your brain is making sense of all of the data, and it's forgetting that your body is a thing, or real life is a thing. So I find that intuitive functions are responsible for imagination and overcomplicating, as Denzel was talking about. So being able to ground your intuition in some sensorial nature is really important. Having friends who can kind of push that out of you. So if it's not your natural tendency to act, having people who do act around you can get you to act naturally. So you can almost engineer the things around you to make it more likely for you to step out of your comfort zone. Because if you're not going to do it naturally, you either need to change you or change your environment. And so, yeah, you have to have a friend like Denzel who just likes to go like, hey, you want to do this thing? And you will then get out of your shell to do things like the knife show and other things.
Yeah, and it's always nice to have a friend like Joyce who's like, all right, yes, we're going to do this thing, but let's also make sure that we take a little bit more time. Like, okay, maybe we shouldn't post this one because yada, yada, yada. And then once again, even then, there's a discussion like, okay, what exactly is your fear with posting this one? Well, I think that boom, boom, boom. Well, no, I don't think that's going to happen. Or even if it does, who cares? Or it's like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe we should slow this down, or we should cut out this part, or whatever. So slowing down is not always a bad thing, but it's also not always a good thing. And then speeding up is not always a bad thing, but it's also not always a good thing. Try to find that balance, just like most things in life, and find a friend who would be able to help you. And I think ENFJs and INFJs, they really do have like a really good dynamic when it comes to stuff like that. So that I think that works out well for us.
Yeah. It's true. And either extreme of the pole can be bad. So if I think about people who are extremely impulsive with acting, you'll think of businesses where the CEOs are more likely to be either like sociopaths or psychopaths. There are studies done on this where it's true that those are correlations. And that's because if you move too fast, you can actually be kind of ruthless in some cases, and you can kind of tear down any human being there. So that's one extreme. And the other extreme of not acting is you have this secret Einstein, Mozart, or this potential to change the world, and they're like never showing it to anyone. They're the clam that everyone needs to open to show the pearl. So show everyone your pearls, everyone.
Exactly. That is the line of today's show. Show everyone your pearls, everyone. And that being said, thanks for watching this week's episode of The Knife Show. Make sure to check out the description if you would like profiling from both of us and / or coaching, or any ideas on video topics that you would like for us to cover. And so thanks for watching once again, The Knife Show. And until next time, stay sharp. また夜が明ければお別